Greetings, anatomy and physiology students. Welcome to a discussion on the respiratory system. In our class, we're going to divide this respiratory system into three sections. So here we go with part one of the respiratory system. This is where we're going to look at some functions and some basic anatomy of this respiratory system. Keep in mind that the whole idea of breathing, or inspiration or expiration, so to speak, is going to give the tissues in the human body a way to get oxygen. And also, not only do we need to deliver oxygen to that tissue, we need to remove carbon dioxide waste. As a general rule of thumb, we have four general main processes involved in respiration in the human body. Our first is going to be pulmonary ventilation. Here we're talking about movement of air in and out of the lungs. The idea is that we're continuously moving the atmospheric gases in and out of those lungs. We want it refreshed and a new fresh atmospheric gases contained within inside those lungs. Another general process is external respiration. So since there's going to be some oxygen inside those lungs, in addition to other atmospheric gases like nitrogen and stuff, such, we need to get that oxygen from the atmosphere into the bloodstream. And that's going to happen here at external respiration. And in addition, there's going to be an excess of carbon dioxide in the blood. That needs to go from the blood into the atmospheric air of the lungs. And then a third main process is going to be the transport of respiratory gases. We've got to get that oxygen from the lungs into the tissues, and that is done thanks to the circulatory system, something we just discussed in this course. And then lastly, we talk about internal respiration. That's going to be the movement of oxygen from that blood into the tissues, in other words, perfusion of the tissues. And once again, we need to get wastes such as carbon dioxide from those tissues into that liquid blood. Again, we're just starting out some general overviews of this respiratory system. We have two general zones. We have a conducting zone, and then we have a respiratory zone. This conducting zone is going to be a series of cavities or tubes, so to speak. Things like the nose, pharynx, larynx, bronchioles, etc. Those all have the purpose of conducting air into those lungs. Once we've gotten that air into the lungs, we need to have the gas exchange occur. So now we're talking about things like respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, alveolar sacs, and alveoli. These items are all on the microscopic level. You would need advanced technology to see these when peering through the tissue, peering at the tissue. So let's now run through some basic anatomy of this respiratory system. The main components of this respiratory system are shown in the diagram on looker's left. We start with the upper respiratory tract. This upper respiratory tract is going to include the nose, the nasal cavity, and the pharynx. And then this lower respiratory tract is going to include the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and the alveoli. It varies from textbook to textbook whether the larynx is part of the upper respiratory tract or the lower respiratory tract. We're going to go with our current textbook saying that the larynx is part of the lower respiratory tract. And so again, the idea is this conducting zone is going to have passageways that serve to transport air to where it needs to go. And again, this respiratory zone is going to consist of structures that participate in gas exchange with the blood. Here we go more in depth into what's happening at the nose and the sinuses. We can do some breathing through the pharynx, through the mouth that is, but we might say the nose is the main conducting passageway for inhaled air. As for functions of having a nose or a nasal cavity, we might say that, of course, number one, it's an airway, but number two, it's going to warm and moisten and filter that incoming air. The idea is that the alveoli in the lungs deep are very delicate and they have very thin epithelia. So we need to warm and moisten this air that comes in contact with that delicate tissue later on down the system. Another function for having a nose in the human body is going to be able to receive olfactory stimuli, sniffing or smelling, in other words. And then also the nose serves as a large hollow resonating chamber to modify speech sounds. We're talking about the nasal cavity as well here. So we see that this nose is formed by a pair of nasal bones, and then along with a couple lateral cartilages and a couple alar cartilages, we get a sort of bridge from the nose, so to speak. These things called nares are also called nostrils. They flare outwards, and these are going to be composed of dense, irregular connective tissue. This nasal cavity then extends from the nostrils to paired openings called concha, and that concha is then going to lead to the pharynx. We'll talk about that in a short few. We also have a nasal septum. That nasal septum is going to divide the nasal cavity into left and right portions. Keep in mind we also have the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone that's going to form a sort of posterior boundary, and then vomer is going to form a anterior boundary. Let's go take a look at some of these concha. We see that we have sort of turbinate shelves, these shelves that exist within the nasal cavity. So the superior, middle, and inferior nasal concha are going to be paired on both sides of the cavity, and they're going to be bony projections that produce turbulence in the inhaled air. So again, recall that we want to moisten and warm that air as it comes in. It's also worth noting that inferior to each pair of the nasal concha is its nasal hiatus. It's noteworthy that we sometimes have slight imbalances, nasal polyps. Those are going to be outgrowths of mucous membranes, and they're usually found around the openings of the paranasal sinuses. So we do have openings for sinuses. We can see in this diagram, here's a frontal sinus, what's not related to the nasal cavity, but we have entrances to other sinuses in this nasal cavity. So whereas this diagram shows a couple of the sinuses, let's take another closer look at some sinuses. Here we have a frontal view and a side view of those sinuses. And these are going to be consisting of olfactory epithelium and respiratory epithelium. Let's take a minute and talk about these sinuses. These paranasal sinuses, as we mentioned earlier, open into the nasal cavity. And so these paranasal sinuses are going to be spaces within the skull bones. So we're talking about sinuses such as the frontal sinus, ethmoidal sinus, maxillary sinus, and sphenoidal sinuses. And again, we're going to find small ducts that connect all the sinuses to the nasal cavity. Let's see. These sinuses do have a function. They're going to lighten the skull, and they warm and moisten the air just like the nasal cavity does, and then also resonating voice. We're going to have some mucus produced in these sinuses as well. And this mucus is going to be produced by a mucous membrane. So that means a lot of these respiratory passageways are going to be lined by mucous membrane. We also call that membrane the mucosa. So the epithelium of the mucosa generally becomes progressively thinner from the nasal cavity all the way up to the alveoli. And so the epithelia that lines most of the respiratory tract is going to contain cells such as goblet cells, and then it's also going to have a basement membrane That lamina propria, so to speak, is going to house both mucus and serous glands. And so this stuff called mucus is produced from combined secretions from those goblet cells, mucus glands, and then those serous glands. And there is a function to having this mucus. It's going to contain a mucin, and that mucin is going to be a protein that increases the viscosity of mucus. And when we increase that viscosity, it's more effective in trapping dust. It's more effective in trapping dirt particles, microorganisms, and things like pollen in the air. In addition, this stuff called mucus is going to contain things like lysozyme, defensins, and immunoglobulin A. That stuff is going to protect against microbes. It is noteworthy that sometimes we get what's called a runny nose, so to speak. And a runny nose can result from increased production of mucus. So exposure to cold air can cause increased production of mucus. Also, an emotional response, such as crying, can cause a runny nose as well. Let's now draw our attention towards a structure in the respiratory system called the pharynx. Here we see a diagram picture on looker's right and a cadaver image on looker's left. We might describe this pharynx as a sort of funnel-shaped passageway, and that's going to be located posterior to the nasal cavity, posterior to the oral cavity, and also posterior to that larynx as well. So air gets conducted along its entire length, but then food and air are going to pass through its inferior portions. What else is there to say about this? It's interesting to note how large the tongue is and what a large muscle mass that is. We'll talk a little bit more about that tongue when we get to the digestive system. It's also worth noting that there's some functions to this pharynx. It's going to connect the nasal cavity with the larynx and the esophagus. It's also going to be a resonating chamber for speech production, and we're going to have tonsils, in other words, lymphatic tissues that protect the entryway into this human body. So we have three divisions to this pharynx. Let's go ahead and look at our first one, the nasopharynx. So this is going to be the superior-most region of the pharynx. And along the lateral walls of this nasopharynx are going to be paired openings, one on each side, called auditory tubes. And you might recall from our previous semester that these auditory tubes are going to connect the nasopharynx to the middle ear. In addition, we have tonsils located in here, our pharyngeal tonsil. Pharyngeal tonsil is going to be located on the posterior nasopharynx wall. There we have that. And we sometimes also call these pharyngeal tonsils adenoids. Specifically, we call them adenoids when they become enlarged. And now I do believe we're ready to move on to the oropharynx. By the way, it is noteworthy that tissue speaking, this nasopharynx is still lined with epithelium. This time it's going to be pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelia. And when we say ciliated, we're talking about the cells containing structures like cilia that beat and move materials upward. We now arrive to the oropharynx, and that's going to be in the middle pharyngeal region, and that's immediately posterior to that oral cavity. And we're going to have palatine tonsils located on the lateral walls of this oropharynx. And then we're going to have lingual tonsils located at the base of the tongue. On the roof, we have a soft palate, and then we also have a hard palate. So this is going to be a common passageway for both food and air. And this oropharynx region is going to be lined with stratified squamous epithelia, the same kind of epithelia that lines the outside of our skin. So in other words, this region is used to abrasion, and therefore, if we lose a few cells, it's okay. Stratified epithelia builds more tissue or more epithelial cells behind those which are lost. We now arrive at the laryngopharynx, and the laryngopharynx is going to be the inferior, sort of narrowed region of the pharynx, and that's going to be located posterior to the larynx, the voice box, in other words. And just like the oropharynx, both the oropharynx and the laryngopharynx serve as a common passageway for food and air. Tissue-wise, we're still talking about stratified squamous epithelium. And now we move on to a new organ in this respiratory system, the larynx, in other words, more commonly known as the voice box. Here we show it on a diagrammic image, and here's a posterior view of a cadaver image. So there is a function to having this larynx, and that's going to provide an open airway so that air can move through. Also, we have a sort of switching mechanism down in this larynx. That means we're going to be able to route air into the proper channel and then food into a proper channel. And in addition, this larynx is going to produce voice, sound, in other words. So this is a sort of cylindrical airway, and it's going to provide continuous flow from the laryngopharynx up into the trachea. Let's see. Let's talk about some cartilages that we might find in the the larynx. Let's see. We have a laryngeal prominence that's located here. You might more commonly know this laryngeal prominence as the Adam's apple, and that's an anterior projection of what's called thyroid cartilage. And then this larynx is going to be held in place by 9 cartilages: a single thyroid cartilage, cricoid, and epiglottis cartilages. And then we're going to have some paired arytenoid cartilages, corniculate, and cuneiform cartilages as well. And so the epiglottis is a very unique structure. That's going to be anchored to the inner aspect of the thyroid cartilage, and it's going to close over the laryngeal inlet during swallowing. And that epiglottis is going to be composed of elastic cartilage. Let's see, we also have some extrinsic ligaments. These extrinsic ligaments are going to attach to the external surface of the laryngeal cartilages, and then they're going to extend to other structures such as hyoid bone and trachea. You might recall hyoid bone from the skeletal system. It is a unique bone in that it does not articulate with any other bones, and here we can see that how that hyoid bone is just sort of suspended there by muscle, ligament, and cartilage. So as we said earlier, this larynx needs to route air and food into the proper channels. Let's look how that's done. So here we have this model eating pizza, so to speak. This epiglottis, perhaps you can see, sort of moves over and covers the air passage when food moves down the esophagus. So let's break that down piece by piece. So here we have some structures in there, and here's that structure called the epiglottis. As mastication occurs with the teeth and the tongue, that tongue is then going to push that food backwards. We're going to call that plug of chewed food a sort of bolus. And as this bolus moves through the pharynx, we get a sort of reflex that occurs. During swallowing, this larynx is going to move upward, and the epiglottis is then going to bend to cover the glottis. The glottis is a sort of opening in the airway passage. So epi means on top of. So here we have a bit of tissue that's covering over that glottis. And so because it covers over it, food then travels down the esophagus and goes where it's supposed to go. That is, into the stomach. Let's back up a little bit, though. We are in the larynx still, and now we're talking about these things called vocal cords. Well, that's a terrible term. Turns out nowadays we're calling these guys vocal folds. So let's take a look at these. We're going to have vocal ligaments that extend between thyroid cartilages and the arytenoid cartilages. The vocal ligaments are going to be covered with a mucous membrane, and that's going to form vocal folds. And it's these vocal folds which produce sounds and are sometimes called true vocal cords. Well, we're going to have openings between the vocal folds, and those are going to be called the rima glottis. And this glottis becomes, this opening, so to speak, becomes formed by the vocal folds and that rima glottis. We then have vestibular ligaments that extend between the thyroid cartilage to the arytenoid and corniculate cartilages. These vestibular ligaments are going to be covered with the mucous membranes, and those are going to be forming vestibular folds. So these vestibular folds do not produce sound. They are sometimes called false vocal cords. And it's noteworthy in here that the extrinsic muscles are going to be skeletal muscles, and these are going to originate on the hyoid bone of the sternum, and they're going to insert onto the thyroid cartilages. And so when we talk about sound production occurs at the vocal folds. And what happens is when we expire, or in other words, breathe outward, those vocal folds are going to vibrate. And so that vibration produces what's called speech. And speech is going to be a modified sound made by the larynx. But once we make that sound, we must sort of modify it by using things like our lips, the pharynx, nasal cavity, and sinuses, tongue and lips. These all modify that sound. So then things like the range of voice, in other words, high voices and low voices, is going to be determined by the length and the thickness of the vocal folds. Any person who's ever perhaps played guitar before knows that when you pluck a guitar string, it makes a low kind of sound. But then when you put a finger on a fret, you decrease the length of that guitar string, and you might observe that the sound that comes out of a shorter plucked string is going to be a higher pitch. So this pitch is going to be determined by the amount of tension on the vocal folds, and that's going to be regulated by the intrinsic laryngeal muscles. And then this idea of loudness, loudness depends on the force of the air passing across those vocal cords. So when the opposite occurs, whispering, whispering is forcing air through almost closed glottis. And therefore it's the oral cavity alone that forms the speech there. And again, we must think also that the sinuses are locations where we might get resonance or a resonating chamber for that speech to occur. It's briefly noteworthy to mention that laryngitis sometimes occurs. Laryngitis is going to be an inflammation of the larynx, and sometimes its surrounding structure. The culprit for laryngitis might be viral infection, bacterial infection, or possibly overuse of the voice. And the result we might get from this is something like a hoarse voice, a sore throat, or sometimes even a fever. Well, we're on this topic of anatomy of the respiratory system, and now we're moving on to the trachea. The trachea is going to be a flexible, tubular organ that extends inferiorly from the neck, from the larynx, and that's going to lead us into the bronchi, the lungs. Well, let's see. The anterior and lateral walls of the trachea are supported by 15 to 20 C-shaped rings of hyaline cartilage. We're going to call these guys tracheal cartilages. So let's take a look at, here we go, that's a better view. Really quick before we move on to that structure, the function of having a trachea is very simple. It's just simply a passageway for air. and it's these cartilage rings that's going to keep the passageway open. In addition to those cartilages, we also have cilia, those tiny hair-like structures on cells. That's going to sweep debris from the lungs back to the throat to be swallowed. Let's look at some divisions of that tracheal wall. We have mucosa, starting from the inside, mucosa, submucosa, hyaline cartilage, and then adventitia. Perhaps we can see that here on this histology image on looker's right. Let's see. It's noteworthy that the location of the esophagus is posterior to the trachea. Why would we have a C-shaped cartilage? We can see that by having an open section of that C-shaped cartilage, we allow large bits of food to move through that esophagus, and therefore these rings do not have food sort of lodged behind it. Again, we're going to have some glands buried in this submucosa, and that's going to produce mucus to help work with the cilia. If you have good eyesight, you can just barely see the ciliated columnar epithelia that lines the mucosa of the structure. It's noteworthy sometimes we have problems that happen. We might have an obstruction in that trachea, as shown here. In addition to a obstruction, we might have a crushing injury as well, or vomit or something in there that's blocking it. So therefore we might do a tracheotomy or a tracheostomy. That's going to be a surgical procedure in which an incision is going to be made into the trachea, and that's going to facilitate breathing when that patient's airway is blocked. And typically they shoot for making an incision in those ligaments that are between the cartilage rings. We also have a structure called a procedure called intubation. That's going to be when we pass a tube from the mouth or nose through the larynx and trachea. On the idea of anatomy of the respiratory system, we left off with the trachea, and now we move into structures called bronchi. Singular would be bronchus. So coming from this trachea, we notice a branching occurs, and that's going to lead us to our primary bronchi. Then when it branches again, we have secondary bronchi, which then branch again to make tertiary bronchi, and then we get bronchioles. Lastly, we're going to have terminal bronchioles. And so this is going to get us to the conduction. This is going to bring us to the conduction, the end of the conduction zones. Then we move on to the respiratory zone. That's where alveolar ducts are going to take over and gas exchange is going to take place. So we get what's called a sort of a bronchial tree. And this bronchial tree is a highly branched system of air conducting passages, and that's going to originate at the main bronchi and then progressively branch off into narrower and more narrow tubes that diverge throughout the lungs. So again, we can start here at the trachea. The trachea bifurcates into right and left main bronchi, and then each main bronchus is going to branch into lobar bronchi. The left lung has 2 lobar bronchi, and the right lung has 3 lobar bronchi. Then these lobar bronchi further subdivide into segmental bronchi, and left lung has roughly 8 to 10 segmental bronchi. Right lung has roughly 10 segmental bronchi. These bronchi are then going to lead to bronchioles. The suffix eols meaning sort of a smaller version of it. And then these terminal bronchioles are going to be the last portion of this conducting pathway. These terminal bronchioles are then going to lead towards respiratory bronchioles, and these respiratory bronchioles are going to be the first segments of what we talked about earlier, the respiratory zone. It's noteworthy that these bronchi do constrict and dilate. So when we get contraction of smooth muscle in that bronchi, that's going to narrow the diameter of the bronchioles. Conversely, when we get relaxation of that smooth muscle, we can increase the diameter of those bronchioles. And here we see that transition in this diagram, that transition from the terminal bronchioles into the respiratory bronchioles. So that's going to put us into the respiratory zone. And we see as we move from the conducting zone into this respiratory zone, the cartilage ring becomes replaced by plates. This epithelia is going to thin, the cilia becomes more sparse. But the smooth muscle is therefore going to increase as we move away from the oral cavity. And then once inside the respiratory zone, we're going to have things like alveoli that consist of simple squamous epithelia. So when we say simple, we're talking about one thin layer of epithelia. Later on, we'll talk about how we have type 1 cells and type 2 cells that secrete surfactant fluid. And later on, we'll also see how we have capillaries that exist in this epithelia. We're going to call that the respiratory membrane. So here we are on a very microscopic level. And so now we're placed squarely in what's called the respiratory zone. That means we're talking about respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and alveoli. The smallest respiratory bronchioles are going to subdivide into thin airways called alveolar ducts. So perhaps we can see that in purple up there. The alveolar ducts are then going to lead to alveolar sacs. We're going to call these sacs sort of grape-like clusters containing alveoli. So these alveoli are small, sac-like, sort of out-pocketing, so to speak, and these come off of the respiratory bronchioles and they come off the alveolar ducts. If we look closely, we see alveolar pores inside these alveoli. These pores are going to be openings between adjacent alveoli. They're going to provide for collateral ventilation. In other words, both passageways can be ventilated through that alveolar pore. If we look closely, we can see that there are blood capillaries. These blood capillaries are going to surround each alveolus for gas exchange. And to just, again, get your bearings straight, keep in mind we're looking at things on a very microscopic level. We're looking at cells here. So notice there's a red blood cell, and notice that this epithelia, well, there we see it has a nucleus to it. So we are on a phenomenally small microscopic level here. Well, in this epithelia, the simple epithelia, we have two types of cells that form the alveolar wall. One is going to be simple squamous tissue. That's going to be our type 1 cell. That's where gas exchange is going to occur. And then we get a sort of cuboidal shaped alveolar cell. That's going to be our type 2 cell. That's going to be secreting alveolar fluid, and that's going to contain a substance called surfactant. These type 1 cells make up most of the alveoli, about 95% of the alveolar surface, and these are going to be moist. And because they're moist, they're going to be prone to collapse because of this moisture causing a high surface tension. One of the unique things about water is it has a cohesive nature. It tends to like to bond with itself. So we need to prevent it from sticking together. So therefore, these type 2 cells are going to secrete pulmonary surfactant. That surfactant is going to work against that surface tension, and it's going to prevent the alveoli from sticking together. Thus, we can prevent the collapse of the alveoli. Take, for example, a short homeostatic imbalance, a respiratory distress syndrome. That's a disorder of premature infants, and that's where the alveoli do not have enough surfactant to remain open. Again, this is happening with premature infants. In addition, we're going to have some macrophages in there. These alveolar macrophages are going to be leukocytes, and they can be either fixed or they can be free. The idea is that they remove debris. They're going to engulf any microorganisms or any sort of particulate material that reach those delicate alveoli. So there we have it. That's the most microscopic level of the respiratory system. We have now seen where gas exchange occurs. It happens at the alveoli. Let's go ahead and back up a bit and look at some gross anatomy, things we can observe with the naked human eye. And that brings us to the lungs. And obviously we have a pair of lungs. And those lungs are going to house the bronchial tree we discussed, and it's also going to house the respiratory portions of the respiratory system. In other words, all the alveolar sacs and alveoli. So again, the function of these lungs is obviously going to be a site of gas exchange. And we're going to look at some anatomy of these lungs, things like the membranes, some gross anatomy, how we might get blood supply to there. So these paired lungs are located within the thoracic cavity, and that's going to be on either side of the mediastinum. These lungs are going to be enclosed and protected by a thoracic cage. Upon observation, we might see that each lung has a wide, concave sort of base, and that base is going to rest upon the diaphragm. You might recall that the diaphragm is a skeletal muscle, and that's a muscle involved with breathing. Then the apex of these lungs is going to be on the superior end of the lungs, and that's going to be posterior to the clavicle. Notice how each lung has a sort of conical or cone shape, and then it's going to have an indented region on the mediastinal surface. That indented region we're going to call the hilum. And this hilum or hilum is going to be a region through which the bronchi pass through. We're also going to have pulmonary vessels pass through and lymph vessels, and in addition, a pulmonary plexus of autonomic nerves. I think we have a view of that. Yeah, there we go. There's a good view of the hilum. Then coming from that hilum are going to be structures that extend from there. We're going to call that the root of the lung. All those structures we just discussed are going to create the root of the lung at the hilum. If we do an external inspection of those lungs, we might make some observations. We might see that the right lung is larger, and it's also wider than the left lung. In addition, this right lung is subdivided into 3 lobes, whereas the left lung only has 2 lobes. In addition, we might see some fissures on there. Let's see if we can take a look at those. Here we go. The horizontal fissure is going to separate the superior lobe from the middle lobe. And then we're going to have an oblique fissure that's going to separate the middle lobe from the inferior lobe. And that works for the right lung. And then this left lung has an oblique fissure, and that's going to separate the superior lobe from the inferior lobe. It's noteworthy that we have structures such as the cardiac impression and the cardiac notch. Those are going to be indentations on the surface of the left lung, and we have this to accommodate the heart. And otherwise, it's probably worthy to note that each segment of the lung is then going to be organized into what's called lobules. Let's talk about blood supply to these lungs. We might remember that the circulatory system has a job of pumping that blood around. We might remember that there's a systemic circuit to that circulatory system and then a pulmonary circuit. So the pulmonary circuit is going to conduct blood to and from the gas exchange surfaces. And the idea is we're going to replenish the depleted oxygen levels and also get rid of excess carbon dioxide. So what happens then is these bronchial arteries are going to branch off of the aorta, and they're going to come from the descending thoracic aorta, and then they're going to divide into form capillary beds. And again, that's going to supply oxygenated blood to lung tissue. We're also going to have bronchial veins. Bronchial veins are going to collect venous blood from these capillary beds. So when we say a double blood supply to the lungs, we're talking about the blood that needs to become oxygenated for the systemic circuit, but also the lungs themselves receive blood to help them function as well. In addition, it's noteworthy that these blood vessels can constrict. And in the response to low oxygen levels, these pulmonary blood vessels will constrict. That way, we do not pick up carbon dioxide on their way through the lungs. In the lungs, we can get vasoconstriction in response to hypoxia. We'll talk about hypoxia in a short few. But what's going to happen when we get that hypoxia, we divert pulmonary blood from poorly ventilated areas into the well-ventilated areas. Later on down the road, we talk about this as ventilation-perfusion coupling. And it looks like that does it for part one of the respiratory system. And next section, part two, we're going to look at pressure in the respiratory system and how we might have respiratory volumes as well. See you then.